The train from Indiana was a slow, rattling beast, its rhythm a steady, monotonous hum against the stillness of the Maryland countryside. For Clara Jensen, a girl just turned 19, that sound was the sound of a new world, a future she had fought for with every fiber of her being. She clutched a worn leather satchel on her lap, a single picture tucked inside, her younger brother Thomas in his baseball uniform, smiling from a field of green. He was the reason she was here. He was too young to fight, but she wasn't. Camp Ritchie was a hive of activity, a place of hard work and harder men. As she stepped off the train, the air was thick with the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and sweat. It was a world away from the quiet farm town she knew, a place where people knew her not just as Clara, but as the Jensen girl, the one who could fix anything, from a stubborn tractor engine to a broken fence line. Her hands, despite her youth, were strong and calloused, a testament to a life of labor. But here those hands seemed to draw nothing but stares. She was assigned to the Ordnance Department, a dusty collection of sheds and workshops tucked away on the far side of the camp. It was a place for mechanics, for gunsmiths, for men who knew the difference between a bolt-action rifle and a carbine by touch alone. She was the only woman in the entire outfit, and she felt it. Every glance, every low-whispered joke, every sideways look was a new lesson in her place. It was a cold, hard welcome. The leader of her section was Sergeant Frank Miller. He was a barrel of a man with a scowl that seemed permanently etched on his face, and a voice that could crack a whip. The moment he laid eyes on Clara, his lips curled into a sneer. "A girl?" he said, his voice dripping with disbelief. He looked at her small frame, then at her uniform, as if searching for a hidden defect. "What are you doing here, little lady? This isn't a dress-up party. This is war." Clara stood her ground, her back straight as a steel rod. "I'm here to serve, Sergeant. I have a mechanical aptitude." "I scored top of my class on the tests," Miller scoffed, a deep rumbling sound in his chest. "Mechanical aptitude. We'll see about that. You can start by sorting these parts. Clean every last one. Don't want any grease getting on those pretty little hands." He gestured to a pile of grimy, oil-slicked metal components piled high in a large crate. It was busy work, demeaning and pointless, but Clara didn't flinch. She simply nodded and went to work. The other men snickered as she picked up the first part, her movements careful and deliberate. The days blurred into a grueling cycle of insults and labor. She cleaned parts, she swept floors, she carried heavy crates, always under the watchful, scornful eye of Sergeant Miller. He never called her by her name, only little lady or the girl. He made sure she felt her difference every single moment. The loneliness was a heavy cloak she wore. She would sit alone during meal times, her thoughts miles away, back in Indiana with her family, wondering if this sacrifice was worth it. Was she strong enough? Was she brave enough? The voices of doubt, planted by Miller and his men, were starting to echo in her mind. But Clara was not one to be easily broken. Her emotional strength was a quiet, steady flame. When the men laughed, she simply worked harder. When Miller tried to humiliate her, she responded with silence and action. She learned the rhythms of the workshop, the groans of the heavy machinery, the quiet focus of the men who were too busy to notice her. It was during one of her quiet, solitary lunches that she saw him. He was a slight older man with tired eyes and hands that moved with an almost surgical precision. He was working alone in a separate, closed-off shed, the one everyone called the secret project. Nobody ever went near it. The men joked it was where they kept the alien spaceships or the new superbomb. He looked up and saw her watching. He didn't sneer. He didn't look away. He just gave her a simple, tired nod. A few days later, a new challenge arrived. One of the main repair machines, a massive drill press, seized up. The motor whined and then died. It was a huge problem. They had a backlog of crucial parts that needed to be worked on. The regular mechanic, a grizzled man named Joe, fussed over it, cussing under his breath, but he couldn't get it to even turn over. Sergeant Miller huffed and puffed, his face red with frustration. "Get it fixed, Joe! We're on a deadline here!" Clara watched from the corner, a cleaning rag in her hand. She noticed something. A slight shimmy in the drive belt, a tiny misalignment of the motor's housing. It was an almost invisible flaw, but her eyes, trained by years of fixing her father's farm equipment, saw it instantly. She hesitated. Should she speak up? Sergeant Miller would likely just laugh at her. But the work was important. Her country needed these parts. Thomas was counting on her. Swallowing her fear, she took a deep breath and walked over. "Sergeant," she said softly, but with a firmness that surprised him. "I think I know what the problem is." Miller turned, his face a mask of fury. "The girl speaks. And what does the expert think is wrong, huh? Did you see it in a catalog? The motor is out of alignment," she said, ignoring the taunt. "It's putting too much strain on the drive belt. I think the mounts need to be adjusted, and the belt itself needs to be replaced." Joe, the mechanic, snorted. "Mounts are fine. I checked them twice." Clara just looked at him, her gaze steady. "With all due respect, sir, the shim is barely visible, but the stress it's causing is not." Miller let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Listen to her! Get back to your cleaning, little lady, before you hurt yourself." But then the quiet man from the secret shed walked out. He had been listening, standing in the shadows. He looked at the machine, then at Clara. His name was Lieutenant Hayes. He was a brilliant engineer, but he was also a quiet loner, a man who preferred machines to people. He held a secret of his own, a heavy weight that kept him isolated. "Let her try, Sergeant," Hayes said, his voice calm but authoritative. Miller's jaw dropped. "Hayes, sir." "This is my section. I don't need a girl telling me how to fix a simple machine." "It's not so simple if it's still broken," Hayes replied, his eyes never leaving the machine. "She spotted a problem you all missed. Let's see if she's right." With a grunt of frustration, Miller stepped aside, giving Clara a look of pure hatred. Clara went to work. With a few simple tools, she went to the motor mounts, making small, precise adjustments. She then replaced the frayed belt, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. In less than 15 minutes, she was done. "Try it now," she said to Joe. Joe, still skeptical, flipped the switch. The motor whined to life, a healthy, steady sound, and the drill press began to hum. There was no shimmy, no strain. It worked perfectly. A stunned silence fell over the workshop. The men looked at Clara, their expressions shifting from mockery to a grudging respect. Sergeant Miller's face was a study in pure, unadulterated rage. He had been shown up and by a girl. He wouldn't forget it. Lieutenant Hayes simply nodded to Clara, a hint of a smile in his tired eyes. He then turned and walked back to his secret shed, leaving Clara alone again, but this time the silence felt different. It was no longer a silence of scorn. It was a silence of grudging, quiet acceptance. As she returned to her work, a single thought rang in her mind. They could laugh at her, they could mock her, but they couldn't deny the truth. And the truth was, she was good at what she did. Little did she know this small act of victory had just bought her a ticket into a bigger and far more dangerous game. The game of a secret weapon that would change the war, and a betrayal that would change her life forever. And the secret was waiting for her, hidden just behind the closed doors of that mysterious shed. The air in Camp Ritchie felt charged after Clara's small victory. The open mockery from the other men had subsided, replaced by a quiet, almost nervous distance. They didn't laugh at her, but they didn't talk to her either. They watched her with a mixture of suspicion and grudging awe, as if she were a new kind of animal they couldn't quite figure out. Sergeant Miller, however, was a different story. His silent anger was a heavy, suffocating weight that followed Clara everywhere. He would assign her the most difficult tasks, hoping she would fail. He would make her stay late, sorting and organizing tools, long after everyone else had gone home. He was a bully who had been put in his place, and he was determined to put her back in hers. One rainy afternoon, as Clara was wiping down a workbench, a shadow fell over her. It was Lieutenant Hayes. He looked tired, with deep lines etched around his eyes and a weary slump to his shoulders, but his gaze was sharp and focused. "Jensen," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You have a good eye." Clara looked up, surprised. "Thank you, sir." "You see things others miss," he continued, gesturing vaguely with a wrench. "A lot of folks see the whole picture but don't bother with the details. The world, this war, it's all in the details." He paused, then seemed to make up his mind. He lowered his voice. I need a pair of hands. A pair of smart hands. Are you interested in real work, not just cleaning up after others? Clara didn't hesitate. Yes, sir. Follow me. He led her to the small, closed-off shed. He unlocked the heavy door and pushed it open. The smell of oil, metal, and something new, something like chemicals and burnt cordite, filled the air. Inside, under a single bare bulb, was a workbench covered in tools and strange metal parts. And there, leaning against the wall, was the object of all the rumors, a secret weapon that looked more like a strange pipe than a gun. It was the M1 rocket launcher, the Bazooka. Clara's breath hitched. She had read about new weapons in the military newspapers, but this was something else. It was crude, simple, almost clumsy-looking. A long, open tube, a hand grip, a sight, and a battery. It seemed impossibly basic, yet she could see the raw potential in its simplicity. This is it, Hayes said, watching her face for a reaction. They call it a rocket launcher. A bazooka, some of the boys in the test groups call it. It's still in early development, a secret project. General Eisenhower himself has an interest in this. He thinks it can be a tool of victory. He saw the look of pure fascination on her face, and his tired eyes seemed to light up. We've had problems, he admitted. The rockets misfire. The recoil is too much. The wiring is faulty. The brass isn't sure if it's a genius idea or a pipe dream. He pointed to a stack of schematic drawings on the bench. The big shots from Washington send us these plans, but they've never been in a workshop. They don't know about the little things, the tiny flaws that make a weapon fail. He picked up a small cylindrical part. We're struggling with the battery connection. It's inconsistent. Causes half the rockets to just fizzle out. Clara, forgetting her fear, leaned in close. She looked at the part. She saw a tiny, almost invisible burr on the metal, a small imperfection that was just enough to interrupt the flow of electricity. It was the kind of flaw that only a person who knew machinery from the inside out could spot. It's here, sir, she said, pointing to the burr. It's small, but it's enough to stop the current from being steady. Hayes's eyes widened. He grabbed a magnifying glass and looked at the part. He was stunned. He had been looking for a major flaw in the design, a big mistake, and all along it had been a microscopic imperfection. Well, I'll be, he whispered. You're right. You're exactly right. From that day forward, Clara's life changed. She still had to deal with Miller's petty cruelty, but now she had a new purpose. Every evening, she would sneak into the shed with Lieutenant Hayes. He became her mentor. Her teacher, the first person in the Army who treated her as a partner, not a problem. They worked for hours, side by side. She learned the mechanics of the rocket launcher, the way the rocket was launched, the path of the current, the subtle changes to the design. She suggested small improvements, tiny adjustments to the wiring and the grip, things that Hayes, with all his big-picture engineering knowledge, had never considered. She even came up with an idea for a simpler sight, a small metal bar that would make aiming the weapon easier for the average soldier. For the first time since she arrived, Clara felt she was truly doing something important. She was helping her country. She was making a difference, but the secret could not last forever. Sergeant Miller, with his constant, bitter watchfulness, noticed their absences. He saw Clara and Hayes heading towards the shed after dinner. He saw them working late. He saw the new confidence in Clara's stride. And he saw his chance for revenge. He started a new round of whispers. He told the other men that Hayes was playing favorites, that he was letting a girl mess with a top-secret weapon. He suggested that they were a threat to the entire project, that they might even be saboteurs. He fed the fire of their distrust, turning their grudging respect back into suspicion. One evening, as Clara was walking back from the shed, she was stopped by Miller. His face was twisted with triumph. "I've been watching you, little lady," he said, his voice low and full of venom. "And I've been watching your friend, the lieutenant. Playing with the secret toys, are we? You think you're so smart? So special?" Clara felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "We're just working, Sergeant, on a project." "A project that is a threat to every man on this base," Miller said with a sneer. "I've filed a report, you see. Told the colonel everything. About you and your little secret. About how you're making changes to a classified weapon without proper authority. About how you're a danger to us all. The colonel wants to see a demonstration, a live fire test. You and your friend. You're going to prove that little pipe dream works. And I'm going to be there to see it fail." He let out a short, cruel laugh. The colonel has no love for secret projects that don't work. He's going to shut it down. And when he does, you'll be a laughingstock. The girl who broke the secret weapon. You'll be lucky if you don't get a dishonorable discharge. He walked away, leaving Clara standing alone in the dark. The cold rain began to fall, but she didn't feel it. All she felt was a deep, burning fear. Miller had gone too far. He had not just tried to hurt her, he had put the entire project at risk. He had put Lieutenant Hayes's career at risk. The bazooka, a weapon of such incredible potential, might be shut down before it ever had a chance to prove its worth. The next day, the order came. A live fire test. The colonel himself would be there. And for the first time since she had arrived at Camp Ritchie, Clara felt the full weight of the fight on her shoulders. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for a weapon, a man who believed in her, and the promise of a victory that might never come. The firing range was a dusty, wide-open space, a long stretch of packed earth leading to a series of metal targets shaped like tanks and armored vehicles. The targets were old, dented things, pockmarked with years of practice fire. But today they stood as symbols of the enemy and the weapon that was meant to destroy them. The morning of the test was crisp and cold. A small group of high-ranking officers stood on a platform, their uniforms pressed, their faces grim. At the center of the group was Colonel Davies, a man with an unyielding posture and a reputation for being tough but fair. He looked at Clara, then at Lieutenant Hayes, his eyes narrow with suspicion. He didn't trust this project, and he didn't trust them. Sergeant Miller stood off to the side, a smug smirk on his face. A small group of his closest men gathered around him, whispering and snickering. He had done his work. The ground was set for a spectacular failure. Clara and Hayes were given a single M1 rocket launcher and a box of 5 rockets. Hayes handed the launcher to Clara. "Your turn," he said, his voice low and steady. "You know it best." Clara nodded, her hands trembling just slightly. She could feel every eye on her, every ounce of doubt in the air. The weight of it all was almost too much to bear. "The first rocket, Corporal," Colonel Davies said, his voice echoing across the quiet range. "Let's see it." Clara took a deep breath. She raised the launcher to her shoulder. It was heavier than she had remembered, a cold, hard tube of steel. She sighted down the simple metal bar she and Hayes had designed, her eye fixed on a distant tank target. She squeezed the trigger. There was a click, a dull, pathetic sound, and nothing else. The rocket didn't fire. A ripple of murmurs ran through the officers on the platform. Sergeant Miller's smirk widened into a triumphant grin. "Misfire!" one of the officers called out. "Told you!" Miller whispered loudly to his men. "A glorified pipe. They can't even get one shot off." Clara lowered the launcher, her heart sinking. She looked at Hayes, who looked back at her with confusion and worry. He had tested the launcher himself just the night before. Everything had worked perfectly. "Try again," Colonel Davies said, his voice tight with impatience. Clara grabbed the next rocket and loaded it. She raised the launcher again, her hands even more unsteady now. She squeezed the trigger. Click. Nothing. The murmurs grew louder. Clara felt a hot, burning flush of humiliation spread up her neck. This was exactly what Miller had wanted. The moment of her total public failure. "Stand down, Corporal," Colonel Davies said, his voice hard. "Lieutenant Hayes, explain this." "This is a disgrace." Hayes stepped forward. "Sir, I don't understand. This was working perfectly yesterday. There must be an issue with the battery or the rockets themselves." "Of course there is," Miller said, stepping forward with feigned concern. "It's faulty design. A woman's touch on a man's weapon. What do you expect?" Clara felt a flash of white-hot anger. She ignored Miller, her eyes scanning the launcher, her mind racing. It couldn't be a design flaw. She and Hayes had worked so hard. It had to be something else. Her eyes fell on the battery. It was the same model she and Hayes had been working with, but something was off. A small, almost invisible scorch mark near the contact point. It was so small, only someone with a trained eye would ever notice it. And she had a trained eye. She knew what this was. This wasn't a flaw. It was sabotage. Miller had found a way to switch out the batteries with ones that had been deliberately damaged. He had been so clever, so subtle that no one would ever have noticed. He was trying to frame them. Without asking permission, Clara reached into her satchel. She pulled out her own personal tools, a small set she had brought from home. She removed the faulty battery from the launcher and pulled out another, a spare they always kept on hand. She looked at the terminal. "It was clean! Perfect! Corporal!" Colonel Davies barked.
What are you doing?
"I told you to stand down!" Clara ignored him, her focus absolute. She placed the new battery in the launcher, her hands moving with a surgeon's precision. She looked at Hayes, her eyes pleading. He understood. He gave her a small, imperceptible nod. She looked at the colonel. "Sir, there was a flaw in the battery. I believe someone tampered with it." "This one is clean." Miller let out a roar of protest. "She's lying. She's trying to cover for her incompetence." Colonel Davies looked from Clara to Miller, his face a mask of conflict. He saw the fire in Clara's eyes, the quiet confidence that had returned, and he saw the triumphant glee on Miller's face. Something didn't add up. "One more chance," the colonel said, his voice a low growl. "This is your last chance, Corporal. One shot. Make it count." Clara didn't need to be told twice. She loaded the last rocket. She raised the launcher to her shoulder. This was it. Everything was riding on this one moment. Her future, Hayes' career, and the fate of this incredible weapon. She looked down the sight, her breath held tight in her chest. She focused on the center of the tank target, seeing not just the rust and the dents, but the enemy it represented, the reason they were all here. She squeezed the trigger. A loud, thunderous roar filled the air. A streak of fire erupted from the launcher's tail, and the rocket shot forward, a fiery arrow of pure power. It flew straight, true, and fast. It hit the tank target with an explosive crash, the steel-on-steel impact a deafening report. The target rocked back on its mounts, a smoking, jagged hole now punched clean through its center. A stunned silence fell over the range. The men, the officers, Sergeant Miller, they all just stared, their mouths hanging open. This was not a weapon. This was a force of nature. It had worked. Clara lowered the launcher, her arms shaking now, not from fear, but from the incredible relief that washed over her. She had done it. She had fought back. Colonel Davies walked forward, his face a mix of shock and wonder. He looked at the smoking hole in the target, then back at Clara. He took the launcher from her, inspecting it with his own eyes. It was crude, it was simple, but it was powerful. He looked at Miller, his expression now one of cold, hard suspicion. "Sergeant," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "you have some explaining to do." Miller looked like a cornered animal. The smirk was gone, replaced by pure, naked fear. The truth was out. The little girl he had tried to break, the weapon he had tried to sabotage, had just changed the course of their lives, and maybe even the course of the war. Clara had won the battle. But the war was far from over. The dramatic success of the live fire test changed everything and nothing. Clara was no longer treated as a joke. The men of the Ordnance Department now looked at her with a certain respect, a hesitant and quiet admiration for the girl who had not only made the weapon work, but had also shown up their own sergeant. Sergeant Miller, humiliated and defeated, was pulled aside by Colonel Davies. The colonel's words were sharp and quiet, and when Miller returned to the workshop, his face was pale, his eyes full of a simmering, dangerous hatred. He had been disciplined, but not yet punished. The buzz around the Bazooka, now officially called the M1, grew stronger every day. Word of its power spread through the camp like wildfire. General Eisenhower's office requested a full report, and a new phase began, a real-world field exercise to test the weapon's effectiveness in a combat-like situation. The test team was a small one, led by a no-nonsense major from Washington who wanted to see if the weapon was a one-shot wonder or a true tool for victory. Clara and Lieutenant Hayes were assigned to the team, their knowledge of the weapon now invaluable. And to Clara's deep unease, Sergeant Miller was also assigned. The major, unaware of the tension, simply saw him as an experienced, non-commissioned officer who knew the base well. The field exercise took place in the rolling, forested hills outside the camp. The scenario was simple. A small team of soldiers armed with the new M1 bazookas had to hold a key road against a simulated enemy advance of armored vehicles. It was a test of the weapon and the resolve of the soldiers using it. For the first few days, everything went according to plan. The team moved through the woods, setting up positions, practicing their shots. Clara, a natural with the bazooka, was now the one teaching the other soldiers, her hands moving with a practiced ease as she showed them how to load, aim, and fire. The men listened intently, their earlier suspicions gone, replaced by a deep need to learn from the best. Even Sergeant Miller, though he tried to avoid her gaze, couldn't deny her skill. He watched her, a bitter scowl on his face, a man consumed by his own defeat. On the third day of the exercise, something unexpected happened. A sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in, turning the dirt roads to slick mud and the forest into a dark, confusing maze. The simulated enemy advance was called off, but the major wanted them to hold their positions until the storm passed. As the rain fell, the radios on the base went silent. A power line had been struck by lightning, and all communication was down. They were alone. Sergeant Miller was in charge of a forward listening post, a crucial position that was meant to spot any movement on the main road. But as the storm raged, he grew restless and anxious. The forest was dark. The wind howled through the trees, and the solitude was too much for a man used to being surrounded by others. In a moment of panic and cowardice, he abandoned his post. He told his men he was going to check a perimeter, but instead he headed back toward the main camp, leaving a critical part of the line exposed. Clara was at a different post, farther back with Lieutenant Hayes. They were huddled under a tarp, the sound of the rain a constant roar around them. Suddenly a sound cut through the noise, the low, rumbling groan of a truck engine. It was a real vehicle, not a simulated one. A local farm truck, lost in the storm, had veered onto the restricted road. The driver, a young man, was trying to turn around, his tires spinning in the thick mud. But he was headed directly for the spot where Miller's post should have been, and he was completely unaware of the live ordnance they had set up for the exercise, a series of small, non-lethal explosions meant to simulate landmines. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. If he kept going, he would hit the trigger wire. He would be injured, maybe even killed. There was no time to call for help and no way to warn him. "He's going to hit the wire!" Hayes shouted, his voice barely audible over the wind. "We have to stop him!" Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed a flare gun and started running. Hayes yelled for her to stop, but she was already gone, sprinting through the mud-slicked forest, dodging branches and slipping on roots. She ran with a single purpose, to get between the truck and the trigger wire. She burst out of the trees and into the road just as the truck was about to turn. She fired the flare gun into the sky. A bright red light exploded in the gray, rainy air. The driver, startled, slammed on his brakes. The truck skidded to a stop, its front tire just inches from the hidden wire. The driver, a boy no older than her brother Thomas, looked at her, his face a mixture of fear and confusion. "What in the world are you doing?" he shouted. "You're in a restricted area." Clara yelled back, her lungs burning, her clothes soaked to the bone. You almost had a real bad day?" He looked down at his tire, saw the tripwire she was pointing at, and his face went white. He understood. He looked at her with awe, a girl in a drenched uniform who had just saved his life. Lieutenant Hayes and the other soldiers came running up. They saw the truck, the tripwire, and Clara standing in the mud, her face pale but her eyes full of fire. She had risked her life to save a stranger. Just then, Sergeant Miller stumbled out of the woods, his uniform stained with mud. He saw the scene and his eyes widened. He had abandoned his post, and now his cowardice was exposed. But he was a master of self-preservation. He saw his chance. He walked over to the major, who had now arrived on the scene, and stood to attention. "Sir," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, "I spotted the civilian truck from my post and immediately went to warn them. Corporal Jensen saw my signal and took swift action. She did a good job, sir." The major looked from Miller to the grateful young man in the truck to Clara. Clara, exhausted and still breathing hard, simply stood there. She looked at Miller, her eyes full of a new, even deeper kind of hurt. He was not just a bully anymore. He was a liar, a thief. He was stealing her sacrifice. Clara looked away, her head held high. She could tell the Major the truth. She could expose Miller's cowardice right there on the spot. But she didn't. The mission was the most important thing. She had a job to do. She had a new weapon to prove. And if it meant letting a lie stand for the good of the team, for the good of the project, then so be it. She had sacrificed her safety to save a life. Now she would sacrifice her own justice to protect the mission. She said nothing. The Major, trusting Miller's word, looked at Clara with a nod of approval. He saw her as a hero. He just didn't know which hero he was looking at. He looked at Miller and gave him a rare, genuine smile. "Good work, Sergeant. Your foresight saved the day." Miller's face, for the first time in weeks, had a look of pure relief. He had gotten away with it. He had stolen Clara's courage and sold it as his own. And Clara, standing silently in the mud, knew the deepest injustice of all. She had saved a life and was now paying for it with her truth. But the story of what happened in the woods on that rainy day was not yet over. The truth, like a bullet from a bazooka, has a way of finding its target. The field exercise was a success, and the M1 bazooka was given the green light for mass production. It was a victory for the project, for Lieutenant Hayes, and for Clara. But for Clara, the taste of victory was bittersweet. Back at Camp Ritchie, she was quietly celebrated as a hero, but the credit for her act of courage on the field had been officially given to Sergeant Miller. He now walked with a swagger, basking in the praise of the Major and the respect of the men who had once looked at him with scorn. Clara carried the weight of his lie in her heart, a heavy and silent burden. The injustice of it all ate at her. She would see Miller talking to the men, telling the story of the lost truck, exaggerating his heroism and her small supporting role. She would hear the whispered rumors of her luck, that she had been there at all. The very people who now looked up to her for her skill with the bazooka were being fed a lie about her character. One evening, as she sat alone, looking out at the last light of the day, Lieutenant Hayes came and sat next to her. "I know what happened out there," he said, his voice quiet. "I saw it all. You know what they say? The truth will out. It always does." Clara sighed. "I don't know. He's already told everyone a different story. And nobody wants to believe the girl who cried wolf." "Maybe not," Hayes said, a small, knowing smile on his face. "But somebody was watching. Somebody who sees things differently." The twist came in the form of a visitor, a surprise inspection by a very senior officer who had flown in from Washington. The officers in charge were on edge. The visitor was General William Hayes, a man of quiet authority, his reputation built not on bravado, but on a deep, almost instinctual understanding of people and machines. He was, it turned out, the uncle of Lieutenant Hayes. He had been quietly following the M1 project, receiving his nephew's reports with a special interest. And now he had come to see it for himself. He spent his first day observing the men, asking questions and watching their movements. He had a way of looking at people, a way that saw through the surface and into the heart of things. He spoke to Sergeant Miller, who puffed up his chest and proudly recounted his heroism in the field exercise. He listened without a word, his gaze unwavering. Then he asked to see Corporal Clara Jensen. Clara was brought to his office, her stomach in knots. She had never been alone with an officer of this rank before. General Hayes gestured for her to sit, and he simply asked, "Tell me about the M1, from your perspective." Clara, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, began to talk. She didn't speak of the mockery or the insults. She didn't speak of Miller's sabotage or the theft of her courage. She spoke only of the weapon itself. She talked about the subtle flaws, the tiny adjustments she and Lieutenant Hayes had made, the feel of the metal in her hands, the power of the rocket. She spoke with a passion and a clear, simple honesty that was impossible to fake. General Hayes listened, his eyes never leaving hers. He saw not a frightened young woman, but a mind, a deep understanding of a complex machine, and a quiet, unflinching integrity. He saw the truth in her eyes, a truth that was more powerful than any lie. When she was finished, he sat in silence for a long time. Then he smiled. It was a kind, tired smile, a smile that had seen both the best and worst of men. "You know, Corporal, he said, his voice soft. My nephew told me something. He told me about a drill press, a sabotaged battery, and a girl who ran into a storm to save a stranger. He looked directly at her. He told me the real story. Clara's eyes welled with tears. The quiet kindness of his words was more overwhelming than all the scorn she had faced. The next morning, the entire camp was assembled on the parade ground. General Hayes stood on the platform, and next to him stood Colonel Davies, Sergeant Miller, and Lieutenant Hayes. The general cleared his throat and began to speak. He spoke about the M1, the brilliant new tool of victory. He spoke about the importance of courage and the importance of truth. And then he looked directly at Sergeant Miller. His voice, which had been so soft, became a clear, sharp blade. Sergeant Miller, he said, his words ringing out across the silent parade ground. Your bravery in the face of danger has been noted. So has your cowardice. You abandoned your post in the storm. You allowed a civilian truck to almost enter a minefield, a mistake that could have cost a life. And you then took credit for the actions of a true hero. Miller's face turned a sickening shade of white. He looked around, trapped. Corporal Clara Jensen, the general continued, his voice now full of respect, was the one who saw the danger and acted. She ran into the storm, saved the civilian, and protected the mission. She is a credit to this army and to our country. Her integrity is an example for every one of you. He looked at the men, at the officers, at Colonel Davies, who stood stiffly, a new understanding dawning on his face. He had been so blind. Effective immediately, General Hayes said, his voice final. Corporal Jensen will be given a promotion and a new assignment. She will lead the first training group in the use of the M1 rocket launcher, our new tool of victory. A wave of murmurs and gasps ran through the crowd. Clara felt a lump in her throat. She wasn't just getting justice. She was getting a chance to lead. The girl who was once mocked, scorned, and underestimated was now in charge of the very weapon that she had helped perfect. Sergeant Miller was transferred to a remote post in the Pacific, a disgrace that would follow him for the rest of his career. He was gone, his lies exposed, his reputation in tatters. Clara stood tall, a new sense of purpose and peace settling over her. She had come to the army with a simple goal, to serve. She had faced injustice and humiliation, but she had never given up. Her courage and her quiet strength had not only saved a life, but they had also earned her the highest respect. She looked at Lieutenant Hayes, who gave her a single, proud nod. She was no longer just the Jensen girl from Indiana. She was Corporal Jensen, a hero, a leader, and the rightful heir to the legacy of a weapon that would, in the hands of good and honest people, help change the course of the war. Her journey to redemption was complete. She had found justice, not in revenge, but in the simple, powerful truth of her own worth, and that she knew was the greatest victory of all.